With just days left in the spring legislative session, there's no budget compromise in sight. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Brian Mackey, State House reporter with Illinois Issues Magazine and Illinois Public Radio. Brian, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Jamey.
And Kent Redfield, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at UIS. Professor Redfield, glad you're here.
Yeah, good to be here.
So we're just going to dive right into it. We're in the last week of the regular legislative session, and there's a lot going on as far as politics goes, but not much going on as far as compromise. Brian, you've been in the State House this week. What's happening?
Well, the Democrats have continued to call up for votes aspects of Governor Rauner's so-called turnaround agenda. This is his pro-business. It was a pro-business anti-union agenda, but he's kind of dropped the anti-union aspects of that for the last week of session at least. But they've been calling up some of these aspects of this agenda for votes and voting them down. They've also begun moving on a budget deal without the governor. So it looks like Democrats are just going to kind of go their own way. They're passing a budget that has some pretty big holes in it, and we're all just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen next.
So those pieces of the governor's agenda that have come up for debate, what are we looking at here? What has actually come up and had votes, be they committee or floor votes?
Yeah, so there's been sort of two phases of this. House Speaker Michael Madigan kind of took the bullet points that the governor had put out a few weeks ago and started writing his own legislation based on what he thought the governor would want in these bullet points, and that was sort of a symbolic matter. Democrats voted no. Republicans didn't even vote yes or no. They voted present, which is basically kind of a protest vote on those issues, and none of those passed. Then, in the last week or so, the governor has actually introduced a few planks of his agenda in legislative form, and the Senate held, particularly the Senate Judiciary Committee, considered workers' compensation, changes to the workers' compensation system, and changes to what's often referred to as tort reform, basically making the legal climate a little more favorable for defendants, businesses, oftentimes who get sued by trial lawyers. And both of those have been voted down in Senate committees. So the governor's agenda, I was trying to tally, has anything from the governor's so-called turnaround agenda passed, and I can't really think of a single sort of legislative accomplishment that he can point to at this point.
And Professor Redfield, we're very close to the end of the session. Don't have a budget deal yet, it seems. Why are we talking about workers' comp, tort reform? How are these connected?
Well, clearly the governor believes that this is the time when he has the most leverage, that we're in a terrible fiscal situation. Unless we're willing to cut the state budget by about 20%, depending on what part you're talking about, you're going to need some revenue. And so he believes the Democrats are really desperate to have some revenue so the cuts will not be as bad. And he wants to leverage that for these substantive changes. Workers' comp, unemployment, tort reform, we seem to have dropped right to work zones for the time being, but we've also introduced constitutional amendments on redistricting reform and term limits. And so the Democrats are saying, how come we have these non-budget items? How is term limits going to fix the state's budget? But the governor his position is that we need to change the whole system in order to turn around Illinois and be more business friendly and grow, and therefore he wants his agenda before we get to the budget, before we get to revenue, and that's the impasse at this point. And it doesn't look likely that anybody's going to blink between now and the end of the week, and then they may very well just leave and come back when we go off the cliff, which is the first day of July. So it's not a happy prospect at this point. And where in the past, when we've got to these impasses, you've kind of had the sense that everybody kind of knows what the deal's going to look like, and they've, you've got people who've been dealing with each other for a long time. in this situation, we've got the two most powerful legislative leaders, Madigan and Collerton, don't know and don't trust the governor, and clearly the governor is not used to working, has no track record with working with Madigan or Collerton, and doesn't know and trust them, and that's not a recipe for kind of suddenly seeing the light. So it could be a long spring/summer.
If I could pick up on something you said, Ken, I was talking to a Republican senator today, and Jason Barrickman, he's from the Bloomington area, and he was talking about how this idea of compromise is the Democrats want more revenue, tax increases basically, and the governor wants these reforms, what he calls reforms passed. And it struck me that I'm not sure the Democrats would even accept the premise that getting to vote for a tax increase is sort of the cookie at the end of the game for them. I mean, that is not a pleasant vote. There are a lot of Democrats who will refuse to vote for a tax increase. Either they're in suburban districts that tended to vote for Rauner or Republicans in the past election, and I'm not sure that they're not even agreeing on what the terms of the debate are. These are, for some of these issues, I mean, they're almost existential issues for Democrats, particularly the union things, which again are off the table. There was State Senator Toy Hutchinson had an interesting comment yesterday when they were debating some of these budget matters. She said, there's lots of negotiations going on, but I don't believe I'm going to negotiate you into being Democrats, and I don't believe you're going to negotiate me into being a Republican. And that's what it seems to come down to. There's just such a stark divide in even what the problems Illinois faces are.
But we did see after the temporary income tax increase was passed, a lot of Republicans kind of bemoaned that was an opportunity to make some reforms, and nothing happened. I mean, how does the minority party get some of these things done if not leveraging a big issue like revenue?
No, and I mean, that seems to be, I think Kent was right on when he said this is the governor's biggest bargaining chip, right? Certainly, Democrats do not want to see cuts. We saw there was $26 million in cuts, what some people have taken to calling the Good Friday Massacre, to a handful of human service programs. I mean, $26 million is a rounding error when you get into the overall state budget picture. And so if we're talking about now billions of dollars, thousands and thousands of millions of dollars in cuts that are going to potentially happen this summer by default if they can't come to a budget agreement, then that's certainly not a place that Democrats or frankly a lot of Republicans want to be in either. But it is big. I mean, I think the governor sees this as his best point of leverage, because if he does come to an agreement, let's say there was some sort of reasonable compromise on the budget deal, I'm not sure what incentive do Democrats then have to enact the rest of his agenda that is pretty far from where they want to see state policy go.
Yeah. And you're going to, in the past, a negotiation and an agreement has meant lots of times a structured roll call where you put certain number of Democrats, certain number of Republicans on a roll call, you craft something that gets it done, but it doesn't create huge problems for particularly the members that are targets in either party. And so, but to come to that is, I think Brian is exactly right. It is so far that you have to move in order to get it done. And so, I think there's still a little bit of a fantasy out there on the governor's part that at some point he'll be able to kind of steamroller everybody and we can get it all done. And I'm not sure what plan B is once you get to the point of shutting down the state of Illinois. And it could get very complicated if we get past July 1 and start with a state shutdown.
Well, it seems to some folks that Plan B, maybe all this campaign war chest that Rauner has, that he may strike back at Democrats through negative ads, that kind of thing. Professor, you really track this, campaign finance issue. How does this play into what's going on, and what do you think might happen? If a deal can't be reached, are we going to see a lot of bruising ads and mailers and all of that?
I suspect that's what's going to happen between the end of during the month of June. Will be just that. The governor has $20 million in a campaign fund. Now, there are limits as to how he can spend that and how much, and what he, how he can go about spending it. But there are also then probably 13, 14 million sitting in these two independent expenditure committees that are supposedly independent of the governor, that are one's supposed to be general, the other's supposed to be pro-Democrat. But it certainly, I wouldn't call the people funding these organizations Democrats. And so you could get a lot of negative mailers out into districts. We've already seen some on both the Republican and the Democrats' side of sending out mailers after the right to work vote, after mailers on the property tax freeze, although that's not a group that's officially associated with Rauner. It's a different group. And so what remains to be seen is how badly can you beat up a member in their district in the month of June, and are you getting anybody's attention? School's out, people on vacation. This is a real, nobody really knows. I mean, you can spend $1 zillion on mailers and DirecTV, but and I assume you can go out and poll someone's district. But again, how much is the member really going to feel that the heat in terms of that? And if that doesn't work, then you're up against the shutdown. And now, sure, you can spend a lot of money against people in the primary in March, but I don't think we're going to shut down state government until we get to the primary next year.
Yeah, I mean, we're 10 months away from. I'm really glad you mentioned that idea of like, where do you spend this money? Because I was thinking about this. It's really the lowest ratings time for TV. People are outside. It's light later. They're not sitting.
Summer reruns.
Right. TV is not putting on the good shows in the middle of summer, so there's just not that many eyeballs in front of TVs. I mean, you're not going to send 6 mailers a day to people. I mean, you have a lot of money, but there are only so many places to spend it. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding from the world of political science is, as long as opposite parties in a political campaign have access to some amount of money, as long as there's not a drastic mismatch, then they tend to cancel each other out a little bit. And you got to think that labor unions, hospitals, doctors, some of the groups that really feel targeted by some of the governor's proposals are going to try to fight back on these. Yeah,
you certainly are going to get a response. And you're also dealing with a Democratic map where there's a big advantage to the Democratic Party who drew the map. Now, the Republicans would have done the same thing, but it's just the nature of how we do redistricting in this state. The Senate has already gone through 1/3 of the senators were up. They're not going to be up 2 years from now. So, you've already got, I think, 11 Democrats that are going to be there. If you start to count numbers that way, then, to get to 30, you only have to add 19 members.
And in a Democratic year, too.
Yeah, and what we assume,
presidential election.
A presidential election. And, I think can you get the House below 71? Sure. I mean, they're at a maximum you can kind of get out of that map. But I think the idea that in one election cycle you're going to turn around the Democratic majorities is probably not realistic. Now, and so a lot of this is a bluff. It is about seeing who's going to blink as we run, 90 miles an hour towards a brick wall here.
But as you said, it's something that really hasn't been done to this degree before. It's going to make some lawmakers nervous, right? I mean, any new territory tends to make them a little nervous when it comes to campaigning and elections.
Legislators hate uncertainty. They like to cast. If you tell a legislator, well, this is something we've already done, and this is just fixing it a little bit on the margins, they're really comfortable with that because, we did it. And I got reelected, it must have been okay. And so they're pretty risk averse, and and the governor clearly is counting on that. But I think Collerton and Madigan have a track record that instills a lot of confidence in their members that their leadership knows what they're doing. And so this is going to be a battle like something we've never seen, purely because all of the governor's power comes not from a political party, not from the typical political organization, but it's all based on money. I mean, he owns the Republican Party in terms of, basically all the money they've got is his. He's able to generate all of these other huge sums of money. And so you've got political power that's rooted in a in money. It's not rooted in organization. It's not rooted in kind of the normal things that we think about in terms of sources of power in politics, organization, and loyalty to and allegiance to party. I mean, it's a very different kind of framework, and fascinating from a distance, maybe not so much fun if you're in the middle of it.
Well, and as many of our regular viewers probably know, we tape the show on Thursday, and the session is going to be running through the weekend. But as things look right now, it appears as though the Democrats are going to send these budget spending bills to the governor without the revenue that would be needed to back them up. Brian, what are the governor's options when these bills land on his desk? It may be a while before they do.
Yeah, and we can get into the parliamentary tactics and gamesmanship that might go on as well later. But I think the governor can sign them, which seems unlikely since he's had his staffers out there using the words Illinois is broke and broken, and we don't need another broken budget, and Democrats just want to raise taxes, and taking a very incendiary public messaging approach this week.
And the argument that they are unconstitutional, given that it is
yes,
a balanced budget,
very
clearly.
reasonable argument that they are unconstitutional, and the Democrats are acknowledging that. They say, yeah, these budgets, they are saying $3 billion. They're assuming some fantasy savings from the state worker health insurance plan that seem speculative at best, and I think so you could even argue that it's $4 billion out of whack. Mm-hmm. The governor's own budget proposal had a lot of these sort of hopeful numbers, we'll call them, euphemistically, like he was going to save $2.2 billion from magically changing the pension system and getting those savings right away as though there wouldn't be a lawsuit, which nobody really thought was realistic. So the Democratic budget is out of whack. You ask, what can the governor do? He can sign them. Unlikely. He can veto them outright. He can mandatorily veto them. I imagine he could try to find some way to continue the game of chicken and say, okay, this is the budget you're sending me, fine, I'm going to start cutting. And I mentioned what was referred to as the Good Friday Massacre earlier. It's worth noting that he did back down from those cuts under some pressure, and that was a much smaller amount than would have to be cut in the next fiscal year. So I think it's just kind of an open question about what's going to happen next. And the true answer is we just don't know.
Professor Redfield, any thoughts on where this might go as we watch it probably continue into the summer?
Well, I think it's unlikely that he'll sign the budget. I think he's going to sit there and talk about it. And he can, even once they put it on his desk, he doesn't have to act right away. Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't run out of we don't have to start with a new fiscal year until July 1st, and so a lot of it's going to be a lot of rhetoric, and this puts everything else in jeopardy. I mean, and so not only are we headed to a shutdown, but things that seem to be no-brainers or that seem to be easy agreements early in the session, all of a sudden there's a big fight. I mean, we're going to combine what the governor wanted with the Department of Economic Opportunity with the Abraham Lincoln Museum changes that the speaker wanted. Now that's gone. The mayor of Chicago wants a casino, and he wants to stretch out his pension payments. That's not going to happen. I mean, all of these things that in more normal times you might have a shot at, or it might, or they would be no-brainers. Everything is going to get basically be collateral damage to what is turning into an increasingly nasty fight. And I find it interesting that all of the attention and focus is beating up on the speaker and saying to the Senate Democrats, don't be don't be under the thumb of the speaker.
Coming from Rauner's camp.
Yeah, coming from Rauner's camp. And John Collerton has easily as strong, the Democratic Senate leader has easily as strong a caucus, maybe a stronger caucus than does Mike Madigan. He is a very smart man, and he does not take kindly to being treated like an afterthought. And so I think that
he's almost offended at not being mentioned in the same breath as Madigan, as somebody who's messed up Illinois.
The idea there.
Yeah, and so I don't think I don't think the governor is going to suddenly find a willing partner in John Collerton the way that Rod Blagojevich at times found a willing partner in Emil Jones, who kind of chafed at the Senate not being as getting as much credit for things as the House did and the Speaker. And so it's not just a 2-ring circus, it really is a 3-ring circus, sometimes getting the House and the Senate to agree. We're just assuming they're going to agree on a number and be able to pass some kind of budget to put on the governor's desk. That clearly could fall apart.
And we are seeing a little, Brian, aren't we, disagreement with education spending, and they're having a hard time kind of sorting that out, just between the two chambers and the Democrats in both chambers, right?
Right, and again, it's just, I think this is getting into a little bit more of the gamesmanship of, what can the governor do? Do we want to precipitate a school crisis? Because we talked about what are the deadlines in the budgeting here. So the session ends May 31st, and then the fiscal year ends June 30th, and then you really start to have some problems in the state in mid-July when the first payroll checks are supposed to go out. And then once you get into August, you're talking about schools closing. And that's the sort of, if schools don't have the money from the state that they need, and some schools have to not open, then you're talking about parents needing to find something to do with their children, and that's where you really start getting everyday people who maybe state government is not at the top of their mind most of the time. They really start paying attention to that. Yeah.
And you would notice, if you're kind of inside, you'd notice certain things not functioning, and certainly if the state police weren't working or the Department of Corrections weren't working, that would be very dramatic, but it's likely that they will continue to work whether we have a budget or not. But if there's no money for the Secretary of State's office, and you can't renew your driver's license, you can't get your car registered, there's a lot of citizens that come in contact with the Secretary of State's office, and all of a sudden, if those doors are closed, people are, a state shutdown is actually going to be seen by the average citizen. They're going to see that much more quickly than a federal shutdown in terms of kind of the impact on their daily lives. And so this is really, we've gone over the cliff. We've gone into July. We've made some state workers nervous, but we've never really had a full-blown shutdown. And we haven't even talked about what might happen with collective bargaining, because those negotiations are going on. We have a strike or a lockout on top of not having a budget.
Well, we can go there if you'd like to. There was, I believe, a memo leaked letting agencies know, or wanting to know from agencies how they would deal with a strike. Maybe just a basic planning thing, making sure that everybody's ready if something like that happens. But have we seen something like this before, Professor Redfield? Or
to greater or lesser extent, every time a contract is up, then it's prudent to talk about contingencies. But we've never had a strike, we've never had a lockout, and the governor is clearly on record talking back in I think 2013 about, if we have to shut it down for a couple of weeks, and in reference to collective bargaining, and that's okay, and I can take the heat, and I'll do the right thing. He
said, he would be proud, and it would be the right thing to do. Not a pleasant thing, but something that he thinks would be, at least at that time, would be the right thing to do. He seems to have walked back from that statement once it sort of hit wider public consciousness nearer the general election. But yeah, it certainly seems like something that people are thinking about. It remains to be seen whether the union would be willing to risk a strike.
Yeah.
This is the governor has talked favorably about the way President Reagan essentially fired the air traffic controllers back in 1981. So I think that he has certainly indicated his seriousness and his desire to mess with public employee unions.
Yeah, and the negotiation positions right now are, the administration is taking a very, very hard line. They're essentially, they want not only no pay raises, but they want huge givebacks, both things that would have a fiscal impact like health insurance, but also things that would affect work rules, that would affect the ability of the union to communicate with its members. He'd like to get rid of fair share, through the contract rather than through the courts, and so it is going to be extremely contentious. And now, clearly, you can't replace a psychiatric social worker by running an ad on Craigslist. I mean, you have to, when you're talking about, well, there are lots of people would take those state jobs, that's not going to happen.
That's true of the janitors in the Capitol, maybe, or
Yeah.
people who do the clerical work or something like that. But yeah, there are a lot of specialized jobs in state government.
And so I think it's, and the kind of the nuances of collective bargaining contracts. I mean, they can get to an impasse. It's not clear whether the governor could make a last best offer and the union would either have to take it or go on strike, or whether, what actually a lockout would look like legally, where he said, we're not going to, don't come into work because, we don't have a contract and I'm not going to allow you to work. And so, we're just, again, are in uncharted waters with people who have absolutely no trust or respect for each other in terms of the rhetoric that's been flying back and forth. And to walk all of that back and to suddenly have an agreement and we're joining arms and singing songs to Mother Jones and all of that, I think that's a little hard to imagine at this point.
Well, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Brian Mackey and Kent Redfield. And it looks like session may be dragging on and on, so we may see you again over the summer. Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View.